we have Nick Laidlaw, who I've known for many years professionally, and he's a dear old friend also. Nick is the CEO of Worldview International Foundation. He is basically advancing high integrity blue carbon projects with measurable ecological and sociological impact. I'm going to let him explain more about what he's done, but Nick has been around the block on in the industries of health, development, USAID, United Nations projects, and he's been very busy over there, particularly in Southeast Asia, but I think more globally recently in his position. And the title of his talk tonight, which I'm very intrigued by, is Navigating the Valley of Death and Carbon Credits. So, as I said, one major focus of Earth Team with the STAR Token program is to support people and organizations along their journey toward impact, and to try to make verification of impacts a little easier, but obviously honest, and to help frontline organizations edge closer toward getting recognized and rewarded, and also even getting some of those credits that I'm sure we'll talk about in a minute. So Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours. You got a big audience, and I'm sure they'll have some comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. I see some brilliant, fantastic, smart, intelligent, and people in the room. It's nice to see some familiar faces, and it's a privilege to be able to share what we're doing, and maybe we'll learn something, and very open to questions and collaboration at the end. Thank you very much, Steve, for allowing me the chance to have a chat today. Thank you for the warm welcome. As Steve mentioned earlier, Worldview creates impact. We then reward our stakeholders. For example, our coastal communities where we work and support with the benefits of carbon finance. So before I get into it, Worldview is an international NGO. For those who aren't aware of us, we've been around for 47 years. We've worked in 26 countries, hundreds of projects. And as Steve mentioned, we've been pioneering blue carbon mangrove restoration projects for the last 13 years, and when we went into Myanmar. Now, the short 30-second story is we have now planted 50 million mangrove trees in the ground across like 7 Verra certified projects, and we're touching 140,000 individual community members in our projects at the moment. So where did we come at this whole carbon market, navigating the valley of death in carbon markets? How did Worldview, this NGO, get involved in carbon markets? We're used to the philanthropic, we're used to the development world, USAID funded. How did that happen? So Worldview went in 2012 to Myanmar, as mentioned, and we had some funds, philanthropic, to help protect shorelines, plant trees, and share some of the benefits and give communities jobs. And then a few years after, the carbon market came along, and it was like, wow, what's that? Oh, it's private sector capital. Oh, that might be a way to scale out impact and do more of these projects. And we did Worldview. We did the world's first Asia-based Verra carbon mangrove project. So quite early days, 13 years ago, and that's led us to learning a lot. And that's what I look forward to sharing some of this experience with you over the course of this presentation. So Worldview is in the middle of it as one tiny actor. There's producing a blue carbon mangrove carbon credit. There's 200 ways to produce a carbon credit. So just as a 101, this space is quite large, and there's a lot of different positive impact that you can create through the carbon markets. I'd love to take you on a 1-minute journey to the field. We always forget that. We sit in our offices, and I'd love to show you a story about how we create impact on the ground, and then I'll get into the slides. Please tell me if volume is not there.
The major problem today is all the CO2 climate gases we have left in the atmosphere. And here is the solution: trees. The mangrove is a miracle tree, and this is the most efficient machine in capturing CO2 and store it in the ground. A mangrove tree mitigates 5 times more CO2 than other type of trees. One mangrove tree can produce oxygen for 4 people. It grows fast, it's easy to plant, and there is plenty of land to plant mangrove trees. From now on, we know we can move very fast. We can plant more than 1 billion trees within the next 10 years. It's like a miracle when the forest has been restored. Life is coming back. They produce food and shelter for small fish, so we get 50% more seafood in mangrove forest. And when people see that they earn more money from keeping the forest than to cutting down the trees, they will maintain it. And if we don't realize that nature is our future, we have no future. Action is needed immediately. Join us and help us to plant more trees.
Okay, so thanks for allowing me to take us into the field. This is where we get our feet dirty, like many on the call and many of the partners on as part of this incredible group. So let's get to it. It's quite a headline. What is the Valley of Death? How do we navigate this? Why does it apply to carbon markets? So the Valley of Death, it's not a new concept. It's quite well understood. It comes from the startup world, which most people recognize. It describes the challenging phase of early investment. You get the money, and then you deploy some of the capital. The company's building, but the product's not ready to be sold yet. So you're not getting any revenue, and you're waiting for that revenue to start coming in. That might be 2 years, it might be 3 years. In the carbon markets, it's extending out, and we'll talk about that. So projects are technically viable. Many projects in this space are technically viable, but they're financially fragile. So how do they attract capital at that very early stage when you don't have a fully developed product? So what we're now seeing with the with the tech world is that carbon markets are seeing the same thing. Okay. You've seen a few slides there, capital being deployed, revenue is not yet flowing, high costs, low cash in, and high uncertainty. So there's that problem. Let's move on. So is it now happening? Well, I alluded to it. Yeah, it's happening. We're seeing additional scrutiny into projects, which is a fantastic thing, and we call it integrity. Yeah, integrity of data. We can all relate to that working in the development space. Data is king. Prove your impact, and for those who do it the best, you should be rewarded for that. And what that means in our carbon markets is that issuances are taking longer to get a carbon credit issuance. And instead of 2 years after the start of a project, it's now taking 3, 4, and even 5 years before you get that carbon credit. Carbon credit, for those who are not aware, is like a commodity. It's an asset. It's traded, and it has value in the market. So until that value comes along and is issued, then you are using up your cash from your first few years' budget. So as we go through this list, fewer credits, issuance delays, higher integrity, higher scrutiny and integrity and expectations on these projects. There's more work to do. It's taking longer to get these assets. It's a short version. I'd like us to hold two thoughts. And that thought is, long-term, the market is improving. That's a positive. It's getting better. But short-term, these improvements are creating immediate stress across all the actors and all the stakeholders, so developers, investors, governments, communities. They will need to see the flow of funds coming through. So the system's under pressure. Getting there requires a heap of work, a heap of capital, and the operators are feeling it. And let's just call this the carbon version of the valley of death. So to get there, it costs money to actually do that work, and I'll talk about that shortly. Here is a short history for us. I just wanted to cover everyone in the room. So traditionally, just tell me if you can see my cursor. Can you see my arrow, Steve? Okay.
Yes.
So phase one is 1990s and 2010s. This is a little history lesson. There was a heap of public and grant funding into nature-based projects or nature-based solutions projects. And it was mainly dominated by World Banks and USAID and NORADs, etc., and philanthropy. Grants represented 80 to 90% of funding back then. So phase two, we moved into in 2010. The voluntary carbon market started to build. That was worth maybe a couple of $100 million, then it went to 500 million, then it went to $1 billion, and then it went to 2 billion. So that's growing. And it started to mature, and methodologies came online. The Veras and the gold standards who've been there since the early 2000s, they started, developing, and more players came along. Corporates started to put or predict that they were going to put carbon on their balance sheet. Yep. And they started getting involved in the voluntary carbon market more and more through their ESG commitments. And of course, the Paris Agreement, and policy and everything just kept on momentum. So public and grant funding continued. And then this takes us to phase three, institutional capital, 2020 onwards. It's very recent. Trading volumes increased. We had dedicated carbon funds. They started off at 20 million. They went to 50. Now they're at $1 billion of carbon of money going into one fund who needs to deploy that capital. We're getting there. These dedicated funds, they're blended finance, they're sophisticated, and they're institutional. Right now, grants represent only 15 to 20% of the total flows versus the early days. And we need to unlock private investment to help scale out these incredible projects across all different types of carbon project design. Here's a slide that many of you might have seen. There's a lot of information on here, but I'd like to think that it will help to describe what are the stages of a carbon project. This is feasibility, pre-feasibility, very early stage. That might take 1 year. PDD is project design document. So you're designing the project. That might take another year. Implementation, planting, as an example for us, implementing and planting mangrove trees, communities on board, lining up all stakeholders. That might take 3 years. In the end, feasibility, project design, and implementation can often take 5, 6, 7 years. There's a lot of work to get to, a first carbon credit, which is here. And then after that, these projects are decades long. They are 20, 30 years in duration. They are long-term. We will not leave this project commitments. And what does that mean as a project developer? It means certain levels of risk. Yep. and just how do we spread that risk so that these projects are more investable and that they are sustainable over that decades-long period. So down here is traditionally, developers will fund this early stage on their balance sheet. Whereas grants and concessional capital, there's hardly any there, but it's coming. So we're trying to find the unlocks to this valley of death between the beginning of the project to first issuance. And we need more capital streams to come in at an earlier stage. And there's some fantastic solutions out there, and happy to share those with our audience. So once you start getting it down to this, planting, you can start to get larger capital finance, okay? And that is good, but all of these other unlocks are pretty rare. You'll see, commercial equity, debt, financing, loans, all of that just doesn't plug in to this market at the moment, and I'll share why. Later on, maybe after year 5, you can get very large funds, big corporates buying in to projects, but they're de-risked for 3 or 4 years already, hence why the capital can get in at this later stage. Okay, so that's the project life cycle. It's matching capital to different project stages, and it is a balance, and it's very challenging for certain project types. Integrity is increased. I mentioned that this is the science of the wonderful nature-based world. Additionality, there's stronger standards forcing projects to prove real-world impact. Permanence, is the carbon going to be there in the ground, stored in a mangrove ecosystem or a tree ecosystem for 100 years? 100 years is a perfect project. There's a lot to do in science. No project is perfect, and that's why you've got great methodologies to allow for different projects to be done. And then transparency. Transparency is key. Without that, you are not going to get anywhere. And I think that's what the buyers and the investors are demanding, and that's what the project developers and the projects need to do, is increasing transparency across the entire ecosystem of stakeholders. So, example, we are communicating, benefit sharing all the way through to government partners, through to communities, and methodologies are now stepping up to say, yes, we also would like you to measure that. So the market's in tandem and it's improving. So with increased integrity risk, there becomes increased financial risk, okay? And someone's going to pay for it or be bound to additional risk to bring in the capital. So there's multiple academics who have written about this, that integrity changes or the integrity increase have fundamentally altered financing dynamics of these projects. What is the solution out of this? We'll talk about it in the next few slides. Historically, developers have used forward offtake agreements where they're selling the asset for 10 years in advance. Hasn't been produced yet, but they'll get paid once the credits come. The 10-year agreement, and you'll see Microsoft and Apple and other big corporates announcing these type of forward offtake deals. Now, that model is breaking down. Forward revenue is less predictable, more integrity, not quite sure how many credits you're going to get. There's methodology changes, there's market pricing. It's not as concrete as what it used to be. So the real bottleneck is financing. Supply, there's more high quality projects that are being developed. They're there. The demand is there. I'll show you that shortly. The demand from buyers, etc. but the finance structures have not kept pace to allow for this institutional grade capital to come in at the right risk profile for us to scale out these projects, especially at the beginning, you know, that valley of death, so call it the first 5 years. Yeah. So investors, back in the early days of Worldview, I'll use us as an example, you know, we were looking at maybe, you know, $500,000 US investment, you know, a certain type of investor with patient capital. And that was 10 years ago, because no one really knew if the asset was going to be worth anything. It was such a new market. You know, first blue carbon mangrove project in Asia. I think there was a handful of projects at the time, but they took a risk. These days, we're looking at minimum 5 million up to 50 million US capital raises. Now that's okay for larger developers who've got land and carbon rights and have a portfolio of credits, but it doesn't work for the other 1,000 potential blue carbon projects that can happen in any country with mangroves. So carbon finance is not suited for all projects. We understand that, but it should be suited for more projects than just this large scale, you know, $5 million plus. I was in Singapore last week speaking at a small state islands event workshop. So there was Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, Fiji, Marshall Islands, from all around the world. And then we're looking at how do we help fund those smaller projects. And fortunately, there are some good solutions coming into play, but it's just an example that, you know, one size doesn't fit all for different types of capital. So a challenge is that as you get to the table and you negotiate these larger deals, that risk is moved over to the developer. Yeah, that's always the case. There's a lot of demand on these projects, and it really comes down to contracting, negotiation, and legal. And it's yeah, it's very similar to an infrastructure capital project structure now and model. Worldview's gone from as an example, you know, traditional philanthropic development type of aid organization, but we're running and implementing for decades infrastructure grade capital project, and that requires certain levels of governance, certain levels of financial structuring, et cetera, et cetera. So you're always taking a step up, and that's very healthy. But it's not for everybody, and you'll see in a future slide what I mean. So one of the other challenges is that there is an infrastructure gap in the market. This market is extremely nascent. Okay, this isn't renewable energies decades ago. You know, they've passed this hump, and they have the infrastructure in play. You have, you know, collateral frameworks and systems, and you know what's on screen here. So the valley of death is not waiting for more capital. It's waiting for infrastructure, but that's not going to get there fast enough because that's a bit of a slow burner. What we need is better structured deals and different types of capital at that early stage. This is a fantastic slide from a gentleman called Benoit Clement. It's quite raw. It's not there to be perfect, but it just shows you. Up here is these buying coalitions. This is the demand side. The demand, and this is the carbon projects down the bottom here. The LEAF Coalition is a coalition of large corporates, and they've committed 1.5 billion. You'll imagine the tech companies, and you'll go, okay, that's who they are. Frontier is the same. Symbiosis is another. And these coalitions are demand drivers. Yeah, they drive demand, and that's fantastic. There's different regulations, and we're opening up to compliance markets. All of this is happening. Demand is there. It's growing. But there's no legal title, not clear. There's no custody. It's not clear on a carbon credit. How do you deal with that on the balance sheet? How do you transact it? This is the asset. And the list is there. That means there's less transactions. And carbon projects are being squeezed at the end of that, saying, well, I'd like to fund my project. I'd like to sell my credits. And really the best ones are getting through. I like this slide. And I think it's a good representation of some of the bottlenecks and the reason why infrastructure is needed to unlock these, the trillions in the capital markets. So let's talk solutions and let's talk what's next. What happens now? So two immediate priorities. We need to fund new projects. So an example, there's 81 blue carbon mangrove projects listed on different methodologies or standards bodies like Verra, Gold Standard, Isometric. Verra has about 60. Worldview has 7 of those. Okay. Now, out of those 60, there is 6 projects that have actually issued credits. 6. So we're really early days. We seem to be slow down in the system of actually getting credits. Now, what the idea is that we need to find different funding stacks or capital stacks to fund more projects, de-risk them, and hopefully we can move the 6 issued projects to 50 issued projects very soon in the next 5 years, because that's what this is all about. It's creating impact. My guess is that out of the 80 projects, I don't have analysis on this, but there's a lot of them which are not funded for the reasons that we've just discussed. It's getting harder and harder. And the second one is building capable actors. That's from investors and funds who can take on different risks, buyers. There's also project developers. And how do you build those institutions? As I explained, Worldview's taking steps up to better governance, better financial modeling, all of those things to attract capital. And that's what is required. And that's capacity building, that's technical knowledge, and I'll talk about collaboration in the future. Being able to receive and deploy capital at scale is also part of the problem. Let's solve that by building up our actors and our partners. So what's the solution? How do you make integrity financeable? How do you help not be in the valley of death for too long? So there's 4 levers that can change that equation. Contracts are increasingly structured to protect buyers. Okay, well, we need those contracts to also be structured to enable projects and protect the project developer. Now, that's possible, but you'll see that balance. There's fragility in the model when it comes down to finance. And as an example, I know there's some fantastic structures that we're implementing to help alleviate this from a project developer standpoint. Blended finance translates demand into deployable capital. That's lots of concessional layers, it's donations, it's philanthropic. That's that early stage. They might not have as many impact measurements that they need, but you'll be able to get to work and design and start implementing your project to unlock future capital later. Investment structuring, I touched on it. It's a real bottleneck. The bottleneck is not supply and demand, as I showed on the previous slide. Supply and demand are there. It's financing. So high integrity projects can't scale without financeable structures. And there's multiple ways of doing that. It's very much leaning into infrastructure grade capital project design and structuring. Now, infrastructure. That's the 4th one there. I'm going to show you another slide and help explain that. Hang on. No. Infrastructure was explained on the previous slide. Yep. Whereby you don't have custody and systems and data. That is not an easy fix, but that is an important fix. And you'll see that being spoken about more and more in this market, and some fantastic people, organizations, collaborations, partnerships to come and help move that forward. So the market's not running out of capital. It's a lack of systems that allow that capital to work. We're a nascent carbon market. It's evolving. There's issues. It's a bit messy, a bit inefficient at times. It's challenging to scale. And there's a lot of work and more work and more work. That's okay. You know, how are we going to get over that? Collaboration is key. This is what Earth Team is about. This is what we all pin our projects and our organizations and we have to collaborate to solve difficult problems. And I won't talk too much more on that. Happy to take some questions, Q&As. I'm available to reach out to at any stage to learn more about what I've presented, and happy to share whatever knowledge we have with our community. So thank you very much for your time. Reach out to me anytime, and open up to questions. And over to you, Steve.
Great. Nick, fantastic talk. You were always a good speaker, and so much of what you said resonated with me, and I know with other Earth Team members and other folks that have come. I mean, I'll turn it over in just one second, but, really appreciate you confirming, the friction there that a lot of frontline projects that are doing good work are experiencing, and it really is a valley of death. The money's there, but the pipeline is constipated. There's things in between, so there's only a few really organizations, the minority, that can afford to advance that kind of capital and wait for the pay on delivery, model. And so, I really hope some of you will come back to see our answer to this problem. In a month or two, we will have our MVP on the STAR token program out. And it's one thing that we're doing with these universities is to test case it, because if you're doing all this great work, people need recognition and support along the way of this journey through this valley. I call it a canyon. It's definitely a valley of death is perfect. So let me stand back from there, and I'm sure we've got some questions and comments. So I'm looking, just go ahead and put you, so Elena, go ahead, you're first.
Thank you. And thank you, Nick, for this amazing presentation and the languaging around this, which is extremely helpful to, I think, it's for us all to gain the language. I think it's actually very crucial. So putting words to something that's just important that we all struggle with. My question is around your role in the capacity building. Like what is that conversation like with those who have capital? What's going on in that space? Is that a clear enough question? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So thanks, Elaine, and thanks for those comments. 10 years ago, there's not too many people who are thinking about putting their money into a carbon investment with an asset that is unsure about what the value is later. So it's quite forward-thinking capital, opportunistic capital. Now, 5 years ago, a number of investors were changed. You've got some funds being formed. You've got you have corporates weren't really looking at directly investing. Yeah, so that wasn't there. It was mainly funds, and you had some foundations. And yeah, holding hands at every stage of that process is what is needed at that early stage of the market. And then now you're having quite sophisticated conversations with funds who have deployed capital many times. So yeah, the hand-holding is less. It's more, let's get down to, how this partnership potentially may work, how the investment is. It's a long-term partnership. It's decades long. So example is, let's say 5 years ago, you had a couple of industry players, energy players who are looking to build internal carbon teams to transact it directly into projects, right? And now that's happening more and more. So yeah, hand-holding, but much less of it. It's really about partnership. It's like anything. It's can you work together? You've got the same values, understanding this is going to be a rocky road. It's not going to be a straight line. And, having the right partners to go on that journey is a short way of saying, yes, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of get to knowing you, but you can bring people along. And that's our role. We do that all the time. So that's on the investor side. And then you've got hand-holding to, this is a new country. They've never done a carbon project. Right. And we did that in Malaysia over the last 3 years, where we've developed Malaysia's first blue carbon mangrove project. And if you could imagine, that was stakeholders from communities to government, with policies not all in place yet. And so it's always capacity building and knowledge sharing and saying eventually, let's do this together. So thanks, Aline.
Just a follow-up question real quick. Does that include private capital as well? Because you talk about funds, like how do you break into that field, that market, those actors? Because they seem to have less of a knowledge about this field that funds generally tend to have.
So there's specific carbon funds. So there's specifically, for example, there might be a US dollar private equity group who's got hundreds of billions of dollars deployed, and they have a $4 billion or $5 billion carbon fund. And that carbon fund then deploys into projects like, in that space. So it's quite specific. So you're talking to funds or people who have got a specific role to deploy capital into these projects. It's all private sector capital majority now. So private sector being institutional grade, wherever it's going from. Some of it wants a return. Yeah. It's great to have a carbon project. It's going to have an asset at the end of it with a carbon credit, but it's also got a lot of co-benefits, community, biodiversity, ecosystem services. That's incredible in these projects. I don't even talk about it, but that's the bonus, impact with financial return.
Very good. Sylvia.
Hi, thanks a lot for this very valuable and interesting presentation. I work for a project, so I am a project developer myself, and work for a company that is carbon consultant and developing projects. And of course, we're quite familiar with the valley of death. My question is more on whenever we looked at potential blue carbon or mangroves, we ran into the issue of prices, because in the end, we had a very hard time as a project developer to make a viable project in terms of what is being paid for a credit at the end of the day, and what you need to basically pay for it to happen, right? Maybe this goes into where you see this development going, what options there are there. Obviously, as a carbon developer, you always hope that there's going to be better times than they are now, because for everyone who's maybe not that familiar, currently their prices are relatively low for what you can get, and it just makes a project very hard to do, because, and especially if you're doing mangrove or something that is this complex as in nature-based, you just have a very big infrastructure that creates an overhead that is substantial. So while upfront payment is one, I think the price that you get at the end of the day for a credit is the other that kind of needs to change, to be honest, at least for us and what we've seen, for it to just make it happen.
Yeah, Sylvia, thank you for sharing that. And it is one of the most common discussions in the space. It's regular. Do the numbers work? How do you make the numbers work? So, you know, it's very, very tight is the short answer. And that's why there's hardly any of these blue carbon projects around the world being implemented, because they're very difficult to make work. Okay, so let's have that as a base. Before I get to pricing, the goalposts kind of keep on shifting a bit. Higher integrity, more work. You got to keep on doing this, you know, and you're like, delayed credits, and that's great, as I mentioned, in the long run. But the short run, it puts pressure on everything: price, costs, numbers, and scale is important. So I would say that you would need to have at least 30,000 hectares of mangrove area to be able to start looking at doing a project. Yeah,
which
as an
excludes,
example.
it already excludes quite a lot of places, right? If you go into communities or if you have all places,
Correct.
it just makes it
And
very, very hard.
that's our experience. And then there's smaller hectareage, there's smaller size projects around the world. Plan Vivo has a couple, and they have a new accelerator. It's fantastic. And they're looking at providing technical support plus some funding on how to get this project up and running. Blue Carbon Plus, WWF have a program now, an accelerator. CI, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy have an accelerator and a small sort of grants and program. They're run
it's
by
not
Hatch
viable,
Blue.
like to my understanding, it's not viable solely with carbon. So you always need this extra funds and this extra money currently. And I would like to see an option for just to make it viable, because there's such good projects, right? There's so much co-benefits and they're so nice that it would be really nice if you could get them off the ground as just projects that are viable.
Absolutely. The unlock is price. That's where you started your question. So right now, blue carbon mangrove projects, sorry, I'm talking about one category a lot here, but it's the example, is around about $25 to maybe $28, $29, right? Over the last couple of years. Let's just call it $30 per credit. Okay. If that moves to 35 or then 38 and 40, that can be the unlock. We're close, right? And so pricing's getting there, and I hope it will continue to be reflective and allow more projects to happen. But it's a market mechanism. So you do the work, and in the end, the market will decide. So,
Niall.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Nick. Just to know where you see markets around nature credits developing, whether you think that'll be like standalone markets or really additional to carbon markets, just stacking on top of existing carbon projects. And then from that, what lessons can be learned from the carbon market world to more rapidly develop nature markets and bring them into being?
Oh, Niall, we could talk for hours on this. I wish it was there already, but it's not. So carbon markets, and there's a lot more people in the room who are much more well-versed in this topic than me, but I'll have a go at it, Niall, okay? Our experience is doing a carbon project, as just described, is difficult enough, and it has its risks and its challenges in that market, which is nascent, growing, and having its getting better. We've looked at biodiversity credits. Without quoting me, let's just, maybe it's, I don't know, a couple of $1 million actual sold, transacted biodiversity credits. Now,
I think it's 6 million. think it's 6 million
Okay.
total.
It's gone up a bit. Fantastic. It's a really nascent, very early stage, and that's great. It'll grow just like carbon has. And then nature, or whatever else we're going to plug in, and this relates to star tokens and measuring impact. And geez, we could do a lot, right, in a lot of different sectors of nature. Biodiversity, as I mentioned, we looked at it. It's like we'll do a pilot because it's at pilot stage essentially. And I'd like to do it we would like to do it in the future. But where does it stack is your question. Can you plug it into a project? Can you get two different assets? Can you do that work adjacently? And yeah, you can. It's more complex. You then have to communicate to all stakeholders what that asset is again. Is there any benefit sharing to it? Is there any value to it? So it's extra work, which is needed. And as you can see, hands are tied to implement at highest quality. If we had one project, I would say, fantastic, let's plug on more pilots. But at the moment, it's needed, very open to it. I'll give you an example now. In our first project in Myanmar, it's in the Irrawaddy Delta and over on the west side of west of Yangon. And they were chopping down mangrove trees for charcoal, for subsistence farming, subsistence living, cooking their main meal at night, and that was okay and understandable. And eventually, we changed those behaviours and introduced carbon, and it took many, many years, but we got there. And no one would think about not protecting the forest anymore. Like they're incredible. But what that's led to is more species of fish, more fish. And there was a beautiful photo of the elephants came back. And we had a National Geographic photographer 2017 in the field. And she came back one morning and said, "Oh my God, I saw the elephants." And they've come back. And now there's a huge number of elephants that have come back. So, it works. How do you measure and then value that ecosystem? And biodiversity credits, I'd love to see, I think is a good future. How they stack with a carbon project and how it manages needs to be worked out. One more example, and hopefully this is helpful. Cook stoves. Cook stoves is just another carbon type project that you can plug into where we do our projects. We don't do that. We do cook stoves anyway. We distributed, I think, 20,000 of them, but we're not going to claim carbon or benefits from that because we think it's just, we don't choose to do that. So there's an example of stacking, and it's challenging.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Niall, for asking the question I wanted to ask. And good answer, Nick. So clearly, we need to keep this conversation going to figure out how we change the model from where it's at to, releasing some of those funds to activate and support frontline efforts. And I know, we need to figure out and talk more, Nick, with you and this group on, how do we change that model? Who do we talk to and how? And that's something that we'll be in a position to do better in a couple months with our new verification program that is designed to address the challenges you've brought up, some of them anyway. I do know that Nick and WIF, the World, his foundation, are open to collaborations and partnerships. And the blended finance that you referred to before. And Nick, before you go off the call tonight, you should look at the chat. You've had a lot of specific requests for being in touch. So don't leave the Zoom before you scrape some of that information, please. And that was a great video, by the way, great to see Arne there and great, solid, focused message. And I just want to offer, we'd love to feature your work addressing some of these challenges on our new newsletter. So let's be in touch about that. And just to let people know, you know, we want to support what Nick and his team are doing. The evolving STAR token program is set up to evaluate and reward everything from major reforestation projects to counter wildlife trafficking actions and programs to, you know, public awareness campaigns, to right down to schools, you know, students planting trees around their school or whatever, and much, much more. We've been working on this. So Nick, this is perfect timing. Appreciate your feedback today. To the rest of you, we do meet here like this, same channel, first Wednesday of every month. And we'll be announcing our spotlight and agenda for next month. But till then, Nick, thanks so much for giving us this time today. This talk has been recorded, so we can share it on with others. And please do stay on and take a look at the chat box. Any other last minute comments from anybody before we call it a go? Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good morning, good night, good afternoon. And Nick, I'll stay on for just an extra few minutes. It'd be great to chat, even 2 minutes. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye from Nairobi.